Our next speaker is Eric Olson from Brandeis University, who will talk to us about native and non-native species, why which, why not, and who can grow where.
Well, thank you, everybody. I really mean that because in contrast to Nathan, I'm going to be talking about things that are sort of outside of my research area. And I think you've come here to hear experts, and I can't claim to be that in this case. So when I say thank you, I mean that this was an opportunity for me to delve into a literature that I wasn't entirely familiar with already. And there's nothing quite like the panic that sets in when you realize you have to talk about something to make you really want to learn quickly. And so it's kind of a, just a truism that teaching is a terrific way to learn. And so you're all a captive audience for my first try at some of this stuff. I delved into this. The reason I was invited to speak here is because I'm known in my town of Newton as the head of the Invasive Plant Task Force. So I organize teams of volunteers. It's really more like a hobby for me. And we go into the local parks. I've sort of expanded out into Waltham now, where Brandeis is. So I work with the Newton Conservators and with the Waltham Land Trust, and we try to tackle invasive plants of various sorts. And so I'm a community ecologist by training. I did my research in Costa Rica on insect food webs and herbivorous insects. And so I have very much a kind of a community ecology take on why invasive plants are not really great things to have in the city. And so this issue of the effect of invasives, plants, and as you see, worms. I love that, global warming. I didn't coin that term, but I did find it in the literature review I did for this talk and thought it was charming. So this topic of the impact of invasions on biogeochemical cycles, I remember saying that term to my mom, and she said, "Don't get uppity." But that is what we're talking about here, where we're looking at things like, the metabolism of cities, as Nathan put it, the ability of soils in cities to either absorb or release carbon. That's a topic I hadn't really explored very much. I'd heard, vague ideas about Norway maples altering soils. I certainly knew that garlic mustard was a notorious soil alterer. It interferes with the mycorrhizal fungi of our native trees. But so I really appreciate this opportunity to sort of, get into a panic, try to learn something quick about invasions and soil chemistry, and maybe during Q&A we can actually talk about how I remove, or my teams remove, invasive plants. But I really want to look more at the chemistry of it right now. All right. And like I say, I have sort of an overview. I did an overview of this whole topic because it was somewhat new to me. And I learned that just a few of these sort of urbanization factoids to give us a kind of big picture look. And I heard a little bit different number. Globally, about 3 to 5% of global land area has been converted to urban and developed land use. And that urban areas in the United States increased by about 130% over 40 years. We're still going, increasing by about 1 million square kilometers over the next 25 years. Within Massachusetts, 38% of the state is considered urban. And of course, you may have all heard that 2014 was a big year for humanity. For the first time in history, over half of the people live in cities, and that continues to grow. if we're talking about only 3 to 5% of global land area, it probably what is going on the other 97 to 95% is going to be arguably more important in terms of carbon balance of the planet. But I want to draw your attention to the last figure, which is over half the people in the world live in cities. And so one of the things I think about a lot as I lead my invasive plant task forces is that I'm an educator, and before I went and did my PhD, I was a teacher at nature centers, and I still think that this connection of people to, the soil and stewardship is a very powerful way to educate. And it's the people in cities who are going to be the ones who really decide on our direction. So even if we're a small land area in total, I think that the connection in stewardship and education, as Adam pointed out, is really crucial. So another thing I learned is that there's this dramatic increase in recent years in the number of papers about urban biogeochemical cycles, very encouraging. And this review paper, Tracking Evolution of Urban Biogeochemical Cycles, made a couple of important generalizations. And I wish I had a generalization to tell you about invasive plants and worms, but you'll see that we're not quite there. But there are some really good generalizations. In general, nitrogen deposition in cities is higher than in the nearby rural areas. And this makes sense because we have nitrogen gets fixed through the combustion of fossil fuels. It's one of those sort of unexpected or unanticipated byproducts of combustion. And where is a lot of combustion happening? Well, it's in cities. In addition, people are applying fertilizers to their lawns. And industry is combusting and producing nitrogenous gases. And so in general, N deposition is more intense in cities and tapers off as you go into the suburb. And this increases forest soil carbon. There is a close relationship between nitrogen and carbon. And so one of the consequences in that top study was a pretty clear relationship. There's actually more carbon sequestered in urban soils than in nearby rural soils in general. JASTRO reported elevated CO2 concentration would increase soil sequestration. This is a kind of a carbon fertilization effect. Where is there a lot of CO2? In the urban areas where there's a lot of emissions. Poyat soil carbon content significantly increased in urban sites in a red oak study. Corner and Kitpetic soil carbon content significantly increased in urban sites compared with rural sites in desert soils in Phoenix. Well, just imagine, people watering and fertilizing the desert. They're going to increase carbon root biomass and so on in their cities. Now, then the last study found that didn't always hold true. They found actually lower soil carbon in urban versus rural sites, and they had to arm wave and figure out why their study was different. And what they came up with was there was a decrease in fine roots. Perhaps these trees needed fewer roots because of the nitrogen effect. They didn't need to scour the soil for nitrogen, and so they reduced their allocation to root biomass. And they also said perhaps the urban heat island effect was increasing the rate of decomposition. So we have 4 or so studies there showing increased carbon sequestration in urban soils and one showing a decline. And I want to point out that the top ones attribute increased carbon sequestration in some cases to increased nitrogen, and that's a consequence of fossil fuel combustion. And so if we leave fossil fuels behind, we may have a decline in that effect over time. So this is like big biogeochemical cycling, and I'm really jealous because they have all these cool data and they can do transects across. And then I have to ask, what about invasions? And I opened all these documents and did searches on, invasions, invasive weeds, nothing. None of these big reviews about carbon sequestration and so on talk about that kind of stuff. But I did find, fortunately, a little note in this chapter noting that ecosystems in urban areas usually contain a higher proportion of exotic and naturalized plant and animal species. And so I thought, this is great, maybe there's something there. And I found this paper, Plant Litter Chemistry and Microbial Priming Regulate the Accrual, Composition, and Stability of Soil Carbon in Invaded Ecosystems. Terrific. And they looked at 2 species of invasive plant in particular. Notice the date, 2014. Looks like we're, getting to this question of do invasive plants influence soil carbon very, very recently. And they looked at kudzu. There's a shed down there, and you can see the kudzu is overtopping the trees. There's a barn. And they also looked at kudzu, and they looked at Japanese knotweed, and that little girl disappeared a few minutes later. She was never seen again. This is a stand before we work on it. This is the afterwards. We go back and forth. Every year it goes back to this, and we do that again. Gradually we're getting headway, but this is one of those cases where even I start to think about herbicide. So what's how would invasive plants affect soil carbon? Well, one way, we think, actually there's evidence that, after an invasion, plant productivity in some cases can increase. The net primary production of a site can increase. So you may get this increase in plant residue. What's the impact of that? Well, it may increase soil organic matter because, if you have a low quality litter, it can actually form a more recalcitrant form of soil carbon. So, more production of plant matter may increase soil carbon. But on the other hand, it turns out that increased fresh plant matter can decrease soil carbon. That seems very counterintuitive. But there's this phenomenon called soil priming, whereby adding nutrients and energy, which is, compost includes a lot of carbonaceous material that can serve as energy for bacteria and fungi. And that can actually boost the activity of those microbes and fungi to such an extent that they attack the soil carbon that's already there. So you feed the decomposers, and they end up decomposing your normal carbon. So they looked at these 2 plants, and here are the results. Japanese knotweed increases soil carbon. Darn. It's like, I don't want that plant to do anything beneficial. And here it turns out it actually increases soil carbon in urban soils. Kudzu decreases soil carbon, and this is viewed as probably a soil priming effect because of the way that kudzu adds nitrogen, it feeds the decomposers, and that ends up attacking the normal soil carbon on the site. A couple others, Norway Maple, Ailanthus. We looked at this, and we found that increases nitrogen mineralization, and the nitrogen can feed the soil, potentially increasing the activity of decomposers. So that may lead to a decrease in soil carbon, but there's a possibility it can increase soil carbon as well by depending on the activity of those decomposers. And so it turned out that those plants did increase nitrogen dynamics in the soil, and why would that be? So I'll just finish off with one really interesting hypothesis that actually links back to my research area. And listen to this. Compared to native species, successful invaders may have thinner chlorophyll-enriched leaves that are also lower in structural carbon. Such characteristics would allow more rapid leaf decomposition, creating litter that contains a higher concentration of nitrogen. Many invasives do not have these soil effects in their native land. So why would leaves become thinner during invasions of plants into new lands? Well, thinner and more readily decomposed leaves are not as well defended against microbes, but they're also not as well defended when they're on the tree against what? What wants to eat a leaf? Insects. And so we may have an interesting phenomenon. When a plant invades a new land, it loses its specialized herbivores. It can allocate more of its energy and nutrients to things like photosynthesis and fruit production, seeds. And its leaves change as a result, making for a more dynamic, labile nitrogen in the soil. I hope you're sort of following here. But it's an interesting hypothesis that actually leads a connection. We may have a connection between the chemistry of soil and the forces of community ecology, like insect herbivory, on invasions. And I have a bit more on earthworms, which we can take up during question and answer, but I think I'll stop there because I believe I'm pretty much out of time. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. I have a brief addendum, if I may. There's an entomologist, I believe, at the University of Delaware named Doug Tallamy, who wrote a book called Bringing Nature Home, which will be available for sale, thanks to the Harvard Coop today. And his objection to invasives is that they have not co-evolved with indigenous insects and other herbivores. And many of these herbivores have very specific dietary relationships to the plants. So when those invasives outcompete the local plants, the insects go away, and the birds that survive on those insects go away, and you've got a whole trophic cascade that starts to disappear. And we all know that biodiversity is the foundation of a healthy ecosystem, and invasives can often create huge problems on that score. So it's just a little aside. Somebody left keys at the registration desk. Carl has them. Carl, where are you? He's probably out there. But they have been found, so they're not lost.